Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Alicia Foreman and I'm excited to be here today for the Pactflow August AMA. Really happy to have a couple of special guests with us today. I'll introduce them shortly. We're going to be talking about a very special topic, which is contract testing with Avro. Our friends who are joining us today are both from one of our consulting partners based out of Germany, Kreuzwerker. They are Kristine Jetzke, who is the CTO at Kreuzwerker, and Anja Gruss, who is the engineering consultant at Kreuzwerker. We've also got familiar face here, Matt Fellows, who is co-founder of Pactflow and also a Pact core maintainer. I'm just going to read out a little bio for each of our guests today, just so you can get to understand their backgrounds and their interests in this area, and then we will jump into the AMA. Before I do that, just a quick reminder, if you're joining us now and you would like to ask a question of the group, we do have some pre-prepared questions. You're also welcome to pop your questions in the chat box, and we will come to those towards the end. So some intros. Kristine, she started her career as a tester before moving on to development and later DevOps. This is one of the main reasons why she fell in love with contract testing. For her, it sits right at the intersection of those areas and touches all the things she cares about: test automation, efficient development processes, and fast and frequent developments. Anja is also joining us, and Anja is a software engineer with a strong Java and Spring Boot focus. While she enjoys writing tests, she will happily fight you over fixed test coverage quotas. She believes in automation, in the power of well-written tests, and in code that is easy to read without needing lines of documentation. Welcome to our guests. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Matt, who is going to facilitate the conversation today.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Alicia. And nice to see you both, Kristine and Anja. So I guess this conversation, it sort of started from a blog post, which we'll probably talk about in a minute or so. But I guess let's just frame the conversation a little bit. We know over the last, let's say, decade or so, definitely since my career started, XML was kind of the predominant data serialization format. But since then, we've moved away from that, RESTful services, but started with JSON, started becoming pretty much the mainstream for microservices. But the amount of use cases now that we've got and the increase in those distributed systems, there's really been an explosion in data serialization formats. So there's message pack, flat buffers, Thrift, protobufs, things like Avro and Parquet and ORC. There's lots of them. So maybe let's just start there. What is Avro, and sort of how, what is it, and what is it different, or how is it different than the other types? And I guess we'll talk about maybe why you use it later. So let me start there. Anja, did you want to answer that one, or Kristine?
Yeah, can I maybe start? I think, Avro, as you already said, it's one of the data serialization frameworks. It started in the Hadoop ecosystem, actually. So I think it's always also interesting where something comes from, what the original use cases were, and it's used to store data in Hadoop, but also it's also the protocol that's used. I don't know, do we already want to go in depth a little bit about Avro? So I think one of the key features is that it comes with a schema. So it has a schema embedded. Especially if you compare to JSON, that's, I think, one of the main differences where, okay, you have JSON schema, but I think it never really took off on the one hand. And also, it's not part of the message itself, whereas in Avro, the message contains the schema, so that's a bit difference already there. And also Avro has two formats. So there's a JSON format and the binary format, which I think is also one of the key advantages, that it has this compact format.
Yeah. Anja, did you want to add anything to that one?
Not really. Tine summed it up pretty well. The only thing is really, for example, JSON schema, while it exists, it's really not used yet. It's still in draft status, and it's still changing, and it's not really accepted in the industry quite yet.
I don't think it ever will. I don't know.
I don't know.
Controversial. I'm looking forward to the comments to come after this one. But I think your point around it being a self-describing message format, right? It has a data structure that needs to be serialized and sent between two systems, whether over a remote interface or if it's used as a sort of I just put the wrong thing there. Sorry for everyone. or for sort of data warehousing type situations, which maybe we'll get to in a moment. I guess, compare it to things like protobufs or thrift or, these types of things. Have you got any sort of, I guess, intuitions about what's different about it and why it's becoming popular?
I mean, one reason why it becomes popular, I think, is really because of Kafka. I think that's also lots of questions like how does it go together with Kafka? I think that's actually, one of the main reasons it's picking up. I think otherwise it would, it would be there in Hadoop, and data engineers and so on would know all about the intrinsics. But I think that's, in my opinion, at least one of the main reasons why it's currently picking up.
Great segue then, because my next question was it seems to be this popular choice for data engineering and warehousing type situations, that big data, that's where it was kind of born, I suppose, Avro, Parquet, and these kinds of things, because of its efficient file format, because of the schema that comes as part of it. But I guess what I'm finding interesting, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is I think you mentioned Kafka and presumably the Confluent schema registry. That seems to be almost transitioning it from what was a technology for big data into more messaging and events. Why do you think that is? Is it simply because Kafka's adding as a first-class support? What is making it a useful format in replacement for things like JSON?
I think it's mainly really the schema, and especially in combination with the Confluent schema registry, you have the history of how the schema evolved.
Right, and so because you've got the registry, it knows which versions of the schema are available as you sort of deploy different versions of your producer, and as a consumer, you've got some extra confidence or extra guarantees. Maybe you could take us through that. So how do you use the Confluent schema registry in that sort of in those use cases to give you that confidence? I guess what are those use cases, and what is the value of the schema registry?
Mainly really confidence. For example, if you use it in combination with Maven plugin, unfortunately at the moment there's not a Gradle equivalent, but you can use a Maven plugin for really creating the schema on the producer side, registering it at the schema registry. You can always validate and test the compatibility against the schema registry server, and the consumer side gets to download the latest versions of the schema from the registry. So you always can ensure that the consumers also have the current version.
Yeah, gotcha. And I guess this is kind of where. Sorry, go on.
I just wanted to add to this maybe a little bit, and also, I mean, I think that's kind of the key advantage is that the registry prevents the producer from producing messages that violate the schema. And I think also the Maven plugin, right? So you cannot compile if you break the schema. So I think this is one of the key advantages actually and it's also, I think this is maybe where also then it relates to Pact, or like where the questions come, how does it relate to Pact? Because it prevents you from in a certain extent, prevents you from breaking changes. So this is one of the key advantages. And I mean, maybe we can elaborate also that there are two, actually more than two compatibility modes. So backwards and forwards compatibility that you can set on the schema. So this will also then prevent you from breaking changes.
Depends on which one you use, yes.
Sorry, carry on. Yeah.
No, sorry.
Yeah, so you mentioned this forward and backwards compatibility mode. So now this is getting out of my territory. I've not dealt with this in too much detail. So is forward compatibility essentially preventing you from adding new fields until the consumer is able to deal with those fields, or is it more around you're allowed to enable forward compatibility, as in by adding new fields, but you can't remove a field, for example? Maybe you could take us through that a bit.
The basic difference between the backward and forward compatibility modes is really who has to upgrade first. For example, if you use the forward compatibility modes, you as a message producer have to upgrade first, whereas with the backward compatibility, you have to wait for your consumers. So that's already a big decision which way you choose. For example, in a current project, we use the forward compatibility. I hate this word, compatibility mode.
Say it 3 times fast.
No, I can't. Definitely can't. And we decided to go for the producers first because in the long run, we as the producing teams will have no idea how many consumers there actually are. So that's that's why we decided for forward. But it brings also a lot of let's say responsibilities you have to take care of in terms of when do I add a field, how do I define this new field, regarding required fields, regarding default values. So definitely both have their pros and cons, and you have to pay a lot of attention. If you use the backward, for example, it's super easy to delete fields. And you can add optional fields, but you can add optional fields in both compatibility modes.
You got it. So I guess, sorry, go on, Christina.
Just want to add on, I think this, maybe we can also mention one of the benefits of Arvo is this option to define default fields, right? So I think that in the schema, you can say, okay, this field, this is the default value. So if a consumer receives a message without the field, it can be assigned. So I think this is also a key benefit.
And
key
most
feature of
important,
yeah.
I would also say most important thing to use working with Avro to try to make sure to have default fields wherever possible, default values wherever possible.
And this is a really interesting point. So, you know, I've not used Avro in Anger before, but you've got the idea of a union to define those optional fields. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
One as you've got your initial schema, so you could define an initial schema with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fields. Let's say it's a product, right? You're publishing a name of a product, the price of a product, and some other description. For example, you got those 3 fields. They're mandatory from day one because they're strings and there's a number, a floating point. And then that goes out into the wild, and then all of a sudden you want to add a new one. Now you've got this problem where going forwards is not so bad, but going backwards is bad now, because now you can't remove a field because there's no default. So one question I had was, do you then end up creating a lot of essentially backwards compatible fields by using optionals, but now you lose the ability to know which fields are actually important? So do you end up creating schemas where you've got lots of optional fields, I suppose is what I'm trying to say, because the default value is going to be just the default value? And do you then lose the meaning of what the message means? So from a binary point, from a wire compatibility point of view, yes, it's compatible, but from an application point of view, those fields, you don't know which field is actually important now because they're all optional.
Yeah.
Is that something that happens, and how do you deal with that?
I would say it definitely happens. One way to deal with that is more not so developer-friendly way of setting up a new topic to really change to a new version of the schema, change the topic, because you can never know for sure how many consumers you have and how far the consumers already are in terms of working through the queue. You always run the risk of having consumers who are still queuing with very old messages. So you don't want to change the schema a lot on the same topic. So you would probably go for setting up a new topic with a new schema. And hopefully at some point you can remove the old topic. But of course, some people maybe want to opt for, let's make everything optional to be on the safe side. But that's really what you said. At some point, nobody will really understand the domain logic behind all the optional fields. And the consumers also won't quite know how to handle everything. Because with default values, in the worst case, you get a null default value.
Yep.
Not really helpful.
What do you do with it?
Also, you lose at some point. I mean, you need to use name. Like then you have, like, what are the names? Like you run out of sensible names, I think, at some point if you change. So, like, I don't know. Let's say you want to change an address from a string to an object or something. Like, and then you have, I don't know, address string, address object 2. I don't know. So I think this is actually one of, if you compare to Pact, I think this is kind of what, if you think about Avro and Pact, this is I think one of the this is the English word. I cannot say the main
benefits,
the
reasons.
difference kind of way different, because with Pact you because let's say in Avro, if you want to remove, you're not allowed to remove a required field. You won't be able to do it. You won't as a producer. So, but maybe what you initially defined as a required field, no one reads. So it's actually not it's from a consumer perspective, not a required field. And I think this is kind of a drawback in a way. But with Pact, you actually know what the consumers are using. And if you have a field that you think is required, but no one ever reads, you're free to remove it.
That's right. And I suppose, coming into the crux of the question, and I guess I'm keen to explore and understand, but what's really ironic about this, and I won't mention names here, but somebody who works for works for Confluent, reached out to me actually last year now, because they wanted to do Pact testing of their proto buffs. And so, a while back, my perception was, well, the schema registry is going to give you some protections against this stuff. And obviously protobufs has the ability of describing itself in a forwards and backwards compatible way, and all the benefits we talk about with these kind of self-describing technologies. And then all of a sudden I have somebody from Kafka reaching out and saying, hey, we want to do Pact testing because, that was when the penny really did drop for me. At that point in time, it was already probably the most popular requested thing. But having somebody who works for the company who does this reach out just kind of hammered that point home. So, I guess, my understanding of the problem is, and it seems to be definitely a trend, whether it's protobufs or Avro, Thrift, flat buffers, all these things, a lot of it's about the wire compatibility. It's about, can the message producer and consumer communicate? But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to understand the message, because the message semantics are over the top of that. So just because a web server can send a message to the client and get back an HTTP 200, that doesn't mean that the consumer knew what to do with that message. It's still possible to break them, right? And so the application level semantics is what we're talking about here. And that's actually where I think where some form of contract testing, whether that's Pact or something else, comes in. So I guess, I'm keen to know, how did you do that? And maybe this is where your blog post comes in, Anja, as well. How do you do that? How do you ensure that the application semantics are covered, given that a schema registry is not going to protect you against that?
I think the blog post was even from UMed regarding how a schema is different from a contract. And that's exactly the thing, because you might even have the situation with you as message producer put in whatever you get. You have different consumers with different needs, which you don't know and you also don't care about. And this at this point, you would go into contract testing to have the really consumer-driven contract, where each consumer service sets up their contract. Like, I always expect this field, I always expect this field with a string value. But depending on the consumer service, they might not even check all the fields that are in the message, because they go for their own domain logic.
Exactly.
And so you have different message consumers with different contracts. And this is where you really get domain logic validation, independent of the basic schema. This is something you cannot do via schema, because you don't want the producer to do 5 topics with tiny differences in the messages, because it's not their job, basically. And this is where you really have the benefit of the contract, because you do the contract testing against the fields you really expect as a consumer. The message producer still has to make sure that they deliver what consumers expect. And you have the additional benefit of being able to look later on, like, oh, we even send fields that no one cares about. Maybe we can really remove them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess continuing on this line of thought, I think one of the challenges with really all the data exchange formats, including JSON, obviously, is that JSON, for example, only has string, number, null, list, map, right? That's it. That's the primitives. There is no date. There's no UID. There's no long. Like these kinds of things don't exist. So obviously, each of these data serialization formats will have various richness in terms of what they can actually support. But as one prospect spoke to us about, was they don't have strict encoding, so you still need to think about that as well, right? So let's say you're using string to put a date in. Well, what's the format of that date? Is that the right format of the date as well? My understanding is, and I'd love for your clarity here, is that you can't do that with these things. That they don't have that. You still need to apply your own logic on top of that to extract the date from the string. Have you run into problems like that before, or how do you deal with that?
It depends. With Avro JSON schema, you can you define kind of the primitive type, but there's also an internal for the deserialization. There's also an additional field where you can set the logical type. So you can, for example, say primitive type is a string, but logical type is a UUID.
Right. So that's applied using JSON schema over the resultant. Once the row has been unpacked, it then gets applied against the schema to be read. Oh, that's very cool. So that definitely seems like a nice benefit over protobufs, for example.
And also with the additional logical type, it also breaks sooner. Like deserialization, the deserializer will attempt to cast it to the logical type, and the same happens on the producer side. So you have a bit more, let's say, safety on both sides.
Yeah, that certainly seems like an advantage over some of the other tools like protobufs. That's really cool. Yeah. Now I forgot my line of thought there. I believe you just put a little message out as well while I resurrect that line of thought. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions for us, please post it in the YouTube chat. I think it's on this side or on that side. I'm not sure which way I'm pointing, but it's in one of the sides. Feel free to drop us a question. We'd love to hear from you and answer it.
Maybe one thought, maybe I can just, because I had one thought, because now we talked a little bit about why Pact can be an advantage, but I think also there's one disadvantage also if you think about Kafka specifically, because if you think about Pact and you do REST, then you basically have two versions maybe, or you have, I don't know, if you have mobile apps, you have more versions, but you have like a very small number of versions in a way that you want to deal with. And so in your Pact broker, you check against a small fixed number of versions. Whereas if you think about Kafka, depending how much data you store, you need a lot of versions. And also there has to be, and we don't have a solution for this yet, but we're actually interested if someone has like to kind of keep the versions with impact and in the schema registry kind of in sync, because basically you would need to run can I deploy against every single schema version here. So this is, I think, kind of a challenge with Kafka, because you have a lot of data that someone can theoretically replay at some point. And
yes, I think that use case is the one that I don't think Pact deals with well, or at least we haven't got a standard use case way of doing that. But exactly that what you want to be able to do at some point in these situations, particularly with Kafka and other kind of event sourcing type architectures, is you want to be able to go, oh dear, we didn't do that properly, or hey, we've got this new idea to reuse the old data, right? And you can go back and reprocess old data. And there's going to be a lineage of data over time that may correspond to different schemas at those points in time. That's a really fascinating use case. And, to be honest, that does seem to be still an edge case. Most customers I've dealt with Kafka really don't go back that far in time and redo that very often, but it's definitely a valid use case. And when you want it, that will be nice to have.
Yeah.
And so the registry is obviously one way to help you there. But of course, you still need your client to be able to deal with all those different versions as well. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of the mobile use case. So in contract testing with Pact, what happens is you may have multiple versions of a consumer live at any point in time, but it's in reverse. So you've got multiple versions of the consumer talking to a single version of the provider, whereas what you're talking about really is different versions of the provider contract and maybe one version of the consumer. But it's the same process, just reverse.
Yeah, I'm just thinking a little bit about the mobile apps. You usually have some deployment process, and then you take with the app version, kind of, you release it. It's a process to release this mobile app version. You tag it, and I think I don't have not that much experience in mobile app, but usually I think you don't want to keep too many versions usually. And I think with the if you use Kafka, you don't have necessarily this kind of
restriction.
Because also it's like regular backend services in a way. You just deploy them all the time. It's not like a mobile app where you have kind of, at least I assume still, I don't know, I didn't do mobile for quite some time, but you still have more fixed versions and don't push out new versions every day. I don't know, maybe that's...
I suppose it depends on how often the contract changes. So you might have lots of versions of the application, but if actually the message that the provider or producer's creating, they're unlikely to change with each version of the provider. Usually, it's not always true, but usually the contract doesn't change that frequently. Such like they're usually stabilized, right? Like maybe early on in a project, there's a lot of iteration happening as the concepts and ideas are being worked through, but then it does stabilize. But yeah, the problem's the same. But with mobile, there's no rule of thumb. It really is going to come down to how often, how quickly consumers will upgrade to the latest version. That's one factor. Second factor is, depending on your audience, you need to be careful, right? Because if you're a bank, for example, you've got a duty of care across a much larger set of audiences, and there's going to be let's say your younger generation who's most likely to be on the latest version of everything. Then you've kind of got your older generation who are probably laggards in terms of upgrading. They've got older devices, so you're going to have a whole spectrum you have to deal with. And then the third dimension is what those updates are doing. So I did some work for a company before who was in the financial space, and they were very, very careful to do what's called a forced update, where that basically says the application will no longer work. You have to upgrade because it's a really disruptive event for your customers. So there's a few different factors that come into it, and obviously your release cadence is also going to dictate how many versions you've got. So it kind of is there, but probably not to the same scale as an event-based architecture.
And I think in terms of REST interfaces, people are more used to paying attention to backwards compatibility, whereas in the eventing, it's so much easier to quickly add or remove a thing and not simply forgetting what it can break on the consumer side. So I think there's still a different way of thinking about REST or event schema, event messages, which is a shame, kind of.
You're on mute, Matt.
Must have pressed the space bar and mute myself. I said you're right. It's still an evolving thing, right? It's still maturing that space, it seems. Event-based architectures have been around, or message-based architectures have been around for a long time, but it feels like it's becoming even more and more popular now. And the ironic thing is, microservices started that way. I don't know if you guys have watched the videos from Fred George, but his architecture was all messages. It wasn't HTTP. It wasn't REST, but it kind of turned into that, right? So it's kind of funny how we go full circle.
Yeah.
So we've got about 1 or 2 minutes to go. Maybe I'll just put it to you guys. Was there any sort of final thoughts or questions or comments, that stand out to you that we should raise here, or shout out to the audience?
I had one just unrelated, but a little bit about conceptually, because especially if you think about Pact, it's always consumer driven in a way. And I think maybe that's also conceptually, and also the idea with event driven is also that you publish events and anyone can just pick them up in a way. So I think also that's just, we didn't have time to elaborate on this, but that's also, I had a thought going into this maybe even conceptually, there's actually a big difference in these approaches. Where maybe in these eventually, you don't even want your consumers so much, because basically, hey, this is my domain event. I define the event, and do what you want with this in a way.
It's a broadcast, right? It's basically you're democratizing data. So It's not about the consumer anymore. It's about publishing what you can do. And I think that what we talk about, a lot of these things, maybe not protobufs in what it was designed for example, but maybe Avro and those where it's designed for sharing data. It isn't about the consumer. It's not about a contract. It's about, this is what we've got right now. This is our model, and here's here's more and more data. And that means you need sort of tolerant readers, right? I think that's one of the strategies you'd normally have with your message-based systems, is being able to be very tolerant with reading new data. And that's, I think, why we play into this. But if your use case is using it for publishing data, that's a bit different than using it as an RPC type mechanism, where you're passing messages to communicate. I think they're two different use cases.
Yeah.
But I agree with that broadcast point. I think that's just a different thing. Good one.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts from you, Anja? We should put a shout out to your blog post. We'll link that there. Did you want to maybe just very quickly, Anja, just give us a summary of that blog post so people can get a bit of a teaser and they can read up on that later?
Yes, I don't know how well it fits in because that's definitely one thing where I didn't use contract testing yet. I'm actually working on it. But this was really about more like how much effort do I have to put in to do integration testing of Avro messages with the schema registry. Because there's a lot of different approaches out there with lots of different amounts of test containers, let's say. And I wanted to find a compromise between performance and version security. So this is what the blog post is about.
Yeah, great. We'll put a link up afterwards in the YouTube description, and hopefully our listeners can look that up. So yeah, I think that's it for now. It's a kind of conversation we could just keep diving deeper and deeper, but that was really fascinating. I learned heaps. So thanks for sharing, Christina and Anja. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was a great time.
Yeah, hopefully it is again. Back to you, Alicia.
Awesome. Before we round out, I have one question. This one's directed at you, Matt. Tell me the difference between Avro and Arvo. Oh dear. For those listeners, this is our little joke. I had a little typo when I was preparing our event page. So this has been a running joke with us. Matt, tell me about that.
I guess for our international audience, Arvo is just a shorthand for afternoon. So obviously Arvo, two letters just need to be flipped one way or another, and all of a sudden you've got a completely different word. So may have had a little dig at Alicia when we set this event up.
Yes, my shorthand is getting a little slack in Slack. And yes, rather than writing afternoon, I write Arvo quite a bit. Please excuse me. Wonderful. Okay, on that high note or low note, I don't know what it is. Let's wrap it up. Christina and Anja, fantastic to have you today. Really appreciate your time. It's been a real pleasure. I just want to round out and give a little plug to kreuzwerker, of course. You are one of our valued partners. If anyone is in the region, definitely have a look at kreuzwerker. They are an Atlassian Platinum solution partner and also an AWS advanced consulting partner, and have offices in Berlin, Munich, Zurich, and Warsaw, and have a dedicated team who build, transform, migrate, scale, and operate AWS and Atlassian workloads. So yes, of course, do check them out if you're in need of any of those services. And on that note, enjoy your day and enjoy your evening, Matt, and we'll catch you at our AMA in September.
Awesome. Thanks, Alicia. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again for having us.
Thanks.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.